Okay, everyone. Thanks for watching this video. I'm sorry I'm getting it up a little late. I had a very busy day today. I know I told you to watch this by Wednesday. That's mostly so that we can discuss it in class. If you find you can't get to it on Tuesday, you're not going to get a chance to ask questions in class on Wednesday, but you can definitely watch it later and email me. So as long as you've watched this and you understand the material before you take the T-Rex on Monday, that's the main thing. We want to talk briefly just about a couple of key flashpoints, key times during the Cold War where it appeared that we could actually break out into open violence. Some of these actually we did break out into open violence between the United States and other communist countries. So I wanted to focus on some of these. These are some of the more famous events that happened in the early part of the Cold War. The only other big event that we're going to spend some time talking about is the Vietnam War, and we'll spend time in class working on that in the next 2 days this week. So, the first big event during the Cold War is known as the Korean War. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. There's a lot to the Korean War, but for time purposes, we're just going to hit a couple of the high points. And then if you have other questions in class, you're welcome to answer them. As we talked about before, North Korea and South Korea were divided only after World War II ended. The northern half of the Korean peninsula was liberated from the Japanese by the Soviet Union. The southern half of the peninsula was liberated and occupied by the United States. Just like in Germany, they couldn't agree on what type of government to put in place. So the Soviet Union made Northern Korea a communist country, and South Korea was made into a capitalist economy with a dictatorship that eventually becomes a democracy by the United States. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. And this initial invasion was very successful. In fact, early on in the war, North Korea almost, as you can sort of see on this map, almost completely conquers the entire peninsula. Obviously, this was a major issue for the United States, in large part because it violated our policy of containment. We went to the United Nations and we got a United Nations resolution put in place to declare a mission to defend South Korea and fight against North Korea. So this war is actually fought under the auspices of the United Nations. It's still a war. Most of the people that fight in it are American soldiers, although other countries do help out. But the most important thing is the number of Americans that fight in the war. After America lands in South Korea, they experience a lot of initial success. And in fact, even though the South Koreans, and you can kind of see on the map, only the southeast corner was still part of South Korea at the moment it was that the American troops and other United Nations forces reached South Korea in 1950. Those eventually, what happens is the Americans and the United Nations forces are very successful, and they push the North Koreans almost all the way back to the northern boundary of North Korea, up here near China. At that point, the Chinese, who it's after 1949, they've already become communist, really begin to send lots of troops in to help the North Koreans because they're very concerned that this United Nations mission in the United States is actually going to invade China and liberate that from the communists as well. So, with a reinforcement of Chinese forces, the fighting moves back towards the middle of the peninsula, right around the 38th parallel. And in 1953, after a lot of fighting, both the North Koreans and the South Koreans and the United States and the Chinese agreed to a ceasefire. That ceasefire is still in effect today, even though this year will be the 60th anniversary of that ceasefire. So basically, after 3 years of fighting, the war goes back to the exact same position where it was, with the 38th parallel being the dividing line, and that boundary is still in effect. This war has not ended. It is just in a state of ceasefire, and as you talked about with Mrs. Kashubik, there are still U.S. troops and still South Korean troops and North Korean troops standing on the border at the 38th parallel today, right now, looking at each other, waiting for the other side to continue the fighting. Hopefully, at some point, we'll come to a resolution and maybe eventually a reunited Korean peninsula like we've seen in Germany. But again, the main purpose of this war is about containment and how the United States is fighting to stop the spread of communism, in this case into South Korea. A couple of quick pictures for you to look at. The photo on the right is a photo of a Korean girl and what looks like her younger brother fleeing from the fighting. The photo on the top left is actually a photo of American troops fighting during the Korean War. This is an important photo because the Korean War is the first war where the U.S. Armed Forces were integrated. Integration hadn't, and segregation was still going on in the United States through the 1960s, but in 1947, the U.S. Armed Forces integrate, and black soldiers and white soldiers fight alongside of each other. The first time that actually happens in combat is in the Korean War. The second flashpoint during the Cold War I'd like to talk about is mutually assured destruction, which has the acronym MAD attached to it, and you'll see why. As we mentioned before, the United States was the first country to build nuclear weapons and the only country to ever use nuclear weapons. But the Soviet Union is very scared about the United States having nuclear weapons as the Cold War begins, and they use their own scientists and a series of spies to acquire the ability to build their own nuclear weapons. And in fact, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union are building lots and lots and lots of nuclear weapons. They're having what we would call an arms race to see who can build the most. And both sides are trying as much as possible to acquire nuclear weapons as much as they can. The belief was, and I know this seems weird, but the belief was that if your country had the most nuclear weapons, the other side would never risk attacking you. The logic being, and I like to think about this in some ways as a water balloon fight. Like if I have a huge bucket of water balloons and my enemies only have a few water balloons, they would never risk attacking me first because they would lose the few water balloons that they had, but then I could pelt them with repeated water balloons to which they could not respond. The theory was that nuclear weapons worked the same way. So as long as my country had the most nuclear weapons, I would be safe because no other side would ever risk attacking me because we could always retaliate afterwards. This isn't necessarily completely logical, but this was the belief that many, both the Soviet Union and the United States had during the Cold War, and this is why they rushed to build as many nuclear weapons as possible. By the middle of the Cold War, the Soviet Union will have as many as 20,000 nuclear weapons. They would never ever possibly use all of these at the same time, but the idea was if they had them all, it would prevent the United States from ever attacking them first, which was a fear that they had. And this is also the same reason why the United States is building so many nuclear weapons, so that we don't get attacked at some point in the future. So it's just this is the underlying assumption behind behind the arms race that takes place during the Cold War. And I think it's important that we talk about it. We'll spend a little bit of time in class on Wednesday talking more about this as well. A third event is the launching of Sputnik. That's a picture of Sputnik, which looks sort of like a salad bowl with some antennas sticking off of it. But Sputnik was actually much more important than that. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first ever artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. It was called Sputnik. This was a big deal because the technology to begin to explore space and to put things in orbit was a big step for human beings, and it was perceived by the United States as something to be very, very, very afraid of. Because if the Soviet Union could control outer space, they could explore it first, they could monitor us from outer space using their satellites, that was potentially a massive threat to our country. This begins what's known as the quote-unquote space race, where the United States will spend immense amounts of money to beat the Soviet Union when it comes to space exploration. In fact, in the early 1960s, a lot of money is put into an institution called NASA, National Aeronautical and Space Administration, by John F. Kennedy, who says that within a decade, the United States will land men on the moon. The reason that we go and do so much space exploration this time, the science piece of it is nice, but really it's about beating the Soviet Union. And as you probably know, in 1969, the United States will be the first country to land people on the moon. This is a big step for human beings, and a lot of the scientific research was propelled by a sense of wanting our country to be better than the Soviet Union and to be first in doing a lot of these different activities. We talked a little bit about this already, but as you know, West Berlin is a city completely surrounded by communist East Germany. And this was a problem during the Cold War, especially for the East Germans, as East German citizens kept trying to escape into West Berlin and thus get out of communist East Germany. In order to keep East Germans into East Germany and East Berlin, the Soviet Union helps East Germany build something called the Berlin Wall, which surrounds the city of West Berlin in 1961. This is more a symbolic step than anything else, because more than anything else, the Berlin Wall represents the barrier. It's sort of a physical representation of the Iron Curtain that divides Western Europe from Eastern Europe. And it's important that we just understand the purpose of this wall, because when the wall comes down in 1989, that really symbolizes more than anything else the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe and the end of the Cold War. The final, and probably the most important aspect of these different events during the Cold War revolves around Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember that the United States' policy was not to allow the spread of communism. This was particularly true when it came to countries right around the United States' territory. You can't get much closer to the U.S. than Cuba. It's 90 miles away. You can see it from Key West. And as you know from our Spanish-American War readings and conversations, the U.S. had a very close relationship with Cuba because we helped it to become independent from Spain, because it was a protectorate, etc. Many Cubans resented this relationship and thought that the U.S. was way too involved in meddling in Cuban affairs. The leader of Cuba in the 1950s was a dictator named Batista, who the U.S. supported, although he was not someone that was universally liked by most Cubans. A group of revolutionaries, led by a man called Fidel Castro, who's pictured there, overthrew the Cuban government and in 1959 took over the island. Once these revolutionaries took over, it was only then that it became very clear that they were communist in their orientation. Castro was really more about just being against the United States. Eventually he comes around to the ideology of communism, but it's not initially clear when he takes over the island that his goal is to make it communist. Obviously, when Castro says that Cuba is now a communist nation, this is a huge problem for the United States. It causes a flood of refugees trying to escape Cuba coming into Miami and other places. And if containment policy can't work in protecting us 90 miles away from the United States, it's very unlikely that it will ever be successful. So Cuba poses a big problem to the United States. In 1960, the United States gets a group of Cuban exiles, people that had run away from Cuba because of communism. We give them weapons and we help them invade a specific place in Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs. This invasion is unsuccessful for a number of reasons, partially because the U.S. doesn't supply the air support that we thought we were going to supply. So the Castro is able to defeat this sort of ragtag army of Cubans, and he claims a huge success, that he was able to defend himself against an attack from the United States. In reality, this attack is very frightening to Castro, because he realizes that the United States is out to get him, and if the United States really sent its true military, it would have been very easy for us to defeat Castro and reconquer the island. As a result, Castro asks for nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, from the Soviet Union, because he knows that if Cuba has nuclear weapons, the United States won't be able to invade, because the moment U.S. troops set foot on the island, that could start a launch of the weapons, which could hit the United States very quickly. It would take about 15 minutes for a nuclear missile launched from the Soviet Union to hit the United States. It would take less than 90 seconds for a nuclear missile launched from Cuba to hit the United States. This would give no warning and could potentially wipe out whole American cities. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy, pictured there, finds evidence through spy planes and other things of the U.S. finds out that these missiles were in Cuba. And that initiates the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy begins by declaring a blockade on Cuba. A blockade, as we've talked about, means no ship traffic going in or out of the island. This was important because the Soviet Union relied heavily, Cuba relied heavily on supplies from the Soviet Union, especially supplies in maintaining this nuclear weapons program, like more nuclear weapons and the ability to fuel them. The Soviet Union responds to this by saying if there is an attack on Cuba, the Soviet Union will automatically launch its nuclear weapons on the United States. Meaning any attempt by the United States to disarm these nuclear weapons by force means that it will start an all-out nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the stakes have definitely been raised. And this is the second closest that the world has ever come to a nuclear war. There's been a lot of movies and a lot of books made about this time, but really if you ask your grandparents who were alive at this time, really for about 7 to 10 days, the entire world lived in fear that a nuclear war could break out at any time. That fear existed frequently during the Cold War, but this was the highest that risk had ever been. You can see on this map here not only the island of Cuba and how close it is to Florida, but also where some of the missile sites were and how they were pointed at the United States. The world moved very, very close to the threat of nuclear war, but in the end, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the Soviet Union's prime minister, they both backed down together. And they sign a secret agreement where the Soviet Union agrees to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for the United States promising not to invade the island. The United States also promised to remove nuclear missiles that we had put in Turkey, which if you think about the geography of that, Turkey is very, very close to the southwestern border of the Soviet Union. So these missiles we had in Turkey were just as scary to the Soviet Union as the missiles they had put in Cuba. So both sides agreed to take a step back. They remove weapons that are close to each other in third-party countries, and the United States promises not to invade Cuba. This is the point at which Fidel Castro gets some security, and it's also the reason why the communist regime in Cuba has lasted up until the present day, because the United States has promised that at least until 1990, when the Soviet Union disappears, it had promised that it would never attack Cuba. Thus, we allow a communist nation to exist so close to us, even though it violated the policies of containment during the Cold War. So, those are the few flashpoints that I wanted to focus on. Again, if you've watched this before Wednesday, you can ask questions about any of this during class. Otherwise, you can email me with questions, as these things might show up as short answers on your T-Rex for Monday. Thank you.